YMG Academy in Florida. And I'm going to, looking at a lot of the titles, a lot of the content, a lot of the sessions that we have today, this is probably a little different. This is very much applied. And I really wanted to share, I think, one of the low-hanging fruit and the realities of sport academies and training. We talk about the impact of coaches and buy-in, even just in Trent, your talk, just the ability for an athlete to see the evidence in front of them. I think there's a massive psychological impact in buy-in and adherence to a program. And so what my goal and objective and what I wanted to share with you guys today was some insights into some of the opportunities of what a true interdisciplinary team intervention brings, and some of the challenges, but also opportunities and implications for your settings, and hopefully some discussion from that throughout the day. So just to give you some context, this is a case study, so it's important to understand a little bit about our environment and how we train athletes and what we do. But just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of IMG Academy before? Great, a handful of you. We are probably most famous or infamous for Nick Bollettieri, who started a tennis academy back in the late 1970s. And really kind of revolutionized, now you can't go very far in Florida without finding an academy somewhere, and took what was a very elitist, individualized sport of tennis and took his experience as a paratrooper with physical toughness and group physical training into the world of tennis, but also added the importance of mental toughness and the ability to train and focus resources for training athletes in a group. Andre Agassi, Maria Sharapova, some of the likes of those players came through this system and very much that kind of group-based training. We've now grown, we're over 500 acres, 8 sports. And here are some of our senior class from last year. So we actually have close to 1,000 student athletes in a full-time kind of like prep school. So most of them are between the ages of 12 and 18. And they're there for an academic year, much like a university, but for kids. The training is also relatively full-time as well. You're talking about 20 hours of sport and physical training per week throughout that year, which again is very similar to a university setting. But this is geared towards the 8 different sports we have. And I'll give you some breakdowns on the demographics and how that unfolds. But of that 950, we're probably about 60 to 70% of those are male, but the sweet spot is really at 14 to 18 years old for the student athletes. Now, this is the model of our human performance team. So this is our athletic and personal development team. We actually have 45 staff who are specialists across, if we take the first 3 columns, if you want, our kind of harder sciences, and of which Dr. Sally Parsonage was probably the founder of our nutrition division that we see on here. But our physical conditioning team and our sports medicine, or as we call it, athletic body management team, work very closely together. And of which there are about 20 individuals who are specialists in those areas. We have 3 in our nutrition division. And then when you see vision, mental conditioning, and leadership, that's essentially, those are the 3 divisions that I run at the academy. And we have 10 either master's or PhD level specialists who work on those 3 aspects. And I'll dive into that a little bit, especially with regards how we treat and how we deal with our injured athlete program. Because just remember, the typical athlete coming to us has a dream. The parents certainly have a dream. They see the Sharapovas and the Agassis and this pipeline, and yourself mentioning your toddlers. I have a 2-year-old, so it's funny to be on the other side of that as a parent and see the opportunity to train in the manner that so many professionals have. And the cost to this kind of training is about $70,000 a year, which is more expensive than Johns Hopkins, where my wife went to med school, and marvel at the fact of the sheer cost of that, but also what's the return on investment and the expectations and the social and psychosocial dynamic that I'll get into in a moment of what that means for a student athlete who's in that kind of school environment and training environment and what the outcomes are based on that. As you see on the far right, the college prep and life skills is really that wider element of what is that investment and return on expectations, because only 2% of our student population will go pro. When you look at the national statistics, which are probably closer to 0.0002 of a school producing professional athletes, that's a staggering amount. But for 98%, what are their expectations and how is that managed? But happy to say that 98% of our graduating class goes on to play college sport in the United States, and 60% of that at the Division I level. It's certainly not a guarantee that the athletes going through are elite, but they are certainly so. Our emphasis turns on development. How do we take an athlete wherever they're at and help them improve and get better? Which has afforded us the focus of 45 specialists across these different disciplines. So, broadly speaking, and this is not an apples-to-apples comparison by any means, but in terms of youth sport participation, 44 million in the United States, and 4.3 of those under 14 are reporting each year for medical treatment of some kind. For us at the Academy, 981 is our student enrollment right now. We have 31 of those students who are currently enrolled in our injured athlete program where they're not able to compete in their sport for 4 weeks or more. And so we had a challenge there of what do we do to help them manage that return to sport, and also how do we manage that healing process effectively for some different reasons. Just our breakup and dynamics. So we do have 8 sports here, and so now when you're talking about body types or types of injuries, there's a real cross-section from tennis, soccer, and see basketball as our top 3 as far as the number of athletes who are in our injured athlete program, to baseball, and you see golf, the anomaly there as far as not in our top 4, but again, the number of instances in golf are understandably low for injuries. We're at 31 right now, so we're not completely through the year yet, but you can see this can range anywhere up to 50 athletes in the program over a given year, but that is spread throughout the year, and these are athletes who are out of their sport for over a month. And if you go back to the math of investing $70,000 in their sport training, coming in as an injured athlete was not what they signed up for, so how do we best value that experience? So from a psychological standpoint, here are some of the basic things that we see. Certainly the loss of morale and confidence. Anyone who's seen and worked with athletes going through this process knows that that's a significant part of their affect and cognitive appraisal that they're going through, as well as the loss of identity, especially if they've always been a tennis player or that's been a huge part of their identity. We can face some real crises with that. The slow transition, number of athletes who it's not just one injury, but it becomes 2 or 3, and the constantly moving deadline of when is that return. And then ultimately, as a business and a for-profit center, you're keeping athletes there as well. So any of you that are familiar with the Wise-Born style has done some terrific work, especially around a biopsychosocial model. And I kind of wanted to just raise the point here from 2 standpoints. If we look at the primary, the situation and context of the individual, there are a lot of different personal factors and situational factors that are at play. And to understand the context, not just of our training venue, but for the individuals who are going through that experience, their personal history, whether they have family support. We have a lot of 80 different countries, much like this conference here, 80 different countries are represented. Some people have no family members there. They're in dorms and with our performance team. Whereas some, maybe a whole family is uprooted or parents are split to be with their child. Whereas, even the dynamics and social support within different sports provide a real context for each athlete experience going through that, and not all the same. And often we see the emotional responses and the behavioral responses, whether it's due to adherence and compliance or lack thereof. But understanding those first two elements of the personal situation is something that's undervalued a lot of the time, and that's where our interdisciplinary piece really can come in. There's a lot of different moving parts here, and we're very athlete-centered but coach-driven. Our Injured Athlete program, though, is driven by our head athletic trainer as the conduit to communication, looking at all these different parties that are involved. Primarily, communication to the parent and the sport coach being the head coach and liaison between all these moving parts, and you can see that there's an awful lot of different people involved. And that's also, I think, what comes at the scale of having 900 to 1,000 student athletes as our core business. But you'll also see here our what we call APD, Athletic and Personal Development staff, from physical, mental, nutrition, our leadership, athletic trainers, PTs, to also the people that work specifically around that sport, as well as the bigger team at play who maybe have different specialties that can really be leveraged for the benefit of the athlete. And then, of course, on site we have a school, kindergarten through actually post-grad high school, so kids who may be coming in to take college classes that will hopefully transfer to whatever college they may be going on to, as well as our health services, and certainly when we get into our clinical psychology integration that we are important to work with. You could probably start to see where some of the problems can start lying. Yes, we're all on site, but you're now talking about the potential for 20 different people to be interacting around that student athlete, and the complications around communication, and how do we really stay truly athlete-centered when Trent even mentioned the scalability and some of the other challenges and issues that we have in play. So primarily, and this is a key term, it's not speed of return, which a lot of coaches like to hear. It's successful return. So we don't want to get people right back into the mix if they're not prepared and ready for it yet. So getting full successful recovery, but also reintegration. And that's where some of the key elements working with the sports to make sure it's not a question of having an intervention treatment, getting healthy, and then going right back into the sport. It's how do we actually integrate back in so when they're competing in their sport, they're less likely to be re-injured as a result of not being ready at game speed, quote unquote. Secondary to that, though, is also this idea of the social and personal climatization. We are talking about human beings, right, not performance robots. And so understanding that through that experience they're integrated with their peers inside and outside of that specific sport. Also, for a lot of our student athletes, they're on the road traveling, a lot of international tournaments. So this actually looking at the windows of opportunity where they can make gains and feel productive, whether it's academic, or also understanding that injuries are part of sport. So what are the opportunities? What is the silver lining? How can they develop and look at transitions later when they will get injured or when careers change, and looking at role models and mentoring opportunities as well. Here's a schedule. This is actually an athlete this coming next week. So in terms of a half day, this is a tennis player with a broken wrist that's being evaluated. We know that he's out of the program for at least 5 weeks. And what I want to draw your attention to is just a few different elements. You'll see there's time in the training room where there's treatment each day, which is really just more supervised. But you see nothing stopping him from integrating with his group and with his team when it comes to tennis practice. But the key was, rather than just sitting there passive on the side, feeling useless and wanting to be in there, really directing his purpose about what is he watching for. How can the coaches utilize him for drills? Also, how to analyze and start paying attention to the game and thinking more like a coach. But this is where some more of the psychology comes in as far as setting specific goals so that there's a purpose to each one of these blocks and not just sitting on the side watching and getting more demoralized. Certainly fitness is an aspect too, looking what they can do as opposed to just on the treatment side of things. And then you'll see in blue here, I can't really highlight especially well, but in the middle here, what we call our athletic and personal development classes. So we offer 7-week curriculum for all of our student athletes to enrich their experience and develop what we call the total athlete. So what are opportunities where they can get an educational experience in nutrition? Okay, leadership program is actually much more about communication and personal development. So we're giving them an opportunity to be productive and develop different skills while they have those blocks of time that we can adjust and shift their attention and focus. We see yoga. We have a vision-based program too, which has also actually become more of a brain training program that utilizes some of the new developments in neuroscience, whether that's looking at using biofeedback. Some of you may be familiar with, is anyone familiar with the NeuroTracker? Cognizance. This is a multi-object tracking tool, a 3D, that has some really interesting impact on cognitive fatigue and developing that endurance. And in fact, that's something that's being utilized for transition and reintegration back into sport. So that idea of being able to process information quickly is a skill that's developed, even though that they can't necessarily compete in their sport. This is a different schedule, but just so you can see, the days are full. And you can imagine when you have this full sport experience too, that's a huge piece that will change if an athlete is injured and now they're not participating. Their schedule just changed completely. So one of the things, when we started this program about 5 years ago, was also that idea of time. Okay, how are people spending their time going from a full sport and school day schedule into something where they are being occupied and they are developing skills that are going to be useful for transition. Coming back to that, I've mentioned the biopsychosocial model a few times, but again, it's very easy to forget context. One of the areas to talk about is we all come from different specialties where we really focus in on our area of expertise and we see our lens through the perspective of our treatment and where we fit into that puzzle. But really it's flipping that model on its head and really looking at the athlete first. Where is the athlete in terms of their cognitive appraisal of what happened and why and where that fits in their long-term goals and dreams? Versus the emotional affect that develops and brings and can explain why people are interacting and obviously behaving and the impact that can have on their outcomes. But that was one of the big organizational shifts, and Dr. Sally Parsonage was part of our initial shift from being a very siloed institution with experts in strength and conditioning and athletic training and some brilliant minds, but really focusing on their silo, as opposed to an organizational shift where it's not about how mentally tough or confident an athlete is. It's about where are they and how can we help them as a team integrate to help them perform better. This is the model that we operate from on a psychological standpoint. And the reason I just wanted to share this, and it's an interesting cross-section of the evidence-based research from positive psychology and sports psychology, but really molded around our academy and these three major factors that we see. But the thing I wanted to call out was confidence is not owned by a psychologist, just as it's not owned by a nutritionist or a physiologist, biomechanist. It is about the athlete's experience and how do we all play a role in developing and forging these outcomes, if we call them cognitive or behavioral outcomes. So, a summary of some of the main challenges, and I'd love to hear from you guys throughout the day or follow up by email as to some of the things that you've experienced, and then also how can we leverage some of the positive sides of these. Communication and collaboration. The bigger that team get, the more potential there is for miscommunication or lack of communication. But philosophically, I'd actually say that what's probably more important is the philosophy of the team, right? and how well people are used to communicating and the mechanisms for being able to do that. When we talk about technological revolution, we're only going to get more data. The question is, what does that data mean and how do we use it? Especially on the athlete end, a visual representation, like the Xbox is a terrific example of something that's actually quite simple and easy to comprehend, as opposed to a 5-page report full of data that really is quite abstract. And how is that presented? Who is it presented to? How is that being utilized? As rife for a lot of miscommunication and trouble. Clearly you saw we have busy days. We're also a shared resource, as Sally will attest to. 45 staff may sound like a lot, but that gets stretched very thin when you start talking about group interventions. So that what Trent said about dividing a group into 4, where there may be a different emphasis on treatment. We certainly divide our injured athlete strength training groups by upper body and lower body injuries, and concussions are dealt with in a different manner. Bias and lack of cohesion, again, comes to philosophy of that group and having strong leadership as truly a human performance team, much more about the athlete than it is about the subject matter experts. And then to an extent, the limits of confidentiality, and you saw how far that the branches go, whether it's the school element or the parents as well as the sport coaches, and if they are dealing with depression or trait level, state level anxiety, where does that communication for the interdisciplinary team end is also can be somewhat of a challenge. But the upside is certainly worth the effort. Replicable in terms of how well we're able to do this, regardless of the student, regardless of the year. One thing that I certainly support and suggest, how many of you do have sports psychology as a resource to those of you who are working in more of an athletic population? Okay, a couple of you, great. I think while there's often a lot of focus and emphasis on mental skills training, there is a hidden asset, I think, whether it's facilitating communication across that performance team and the impact of goal setting and clarity across that team too, can be a huge benefit. And we are fortunate to have 10 mental coaches at the academy, which means that each sport has that mental coach who is also embedded with the team and develops a very strong relationship with the coaching staff, as well as with that athletic and personal development pod of nutritionists and athletic trainers and that support team. We've found that role has probably played the key one as far as facilitating the group approach, if not the actual interventions and so on. Proactive. We know it's going to happen, so having these systems in place is also seems like a no-brainer, but it's amazing how often things seem reactive. And so really being proactive and setting these things up, looking at what may be optimal in a group setting, but then how can we gear that into something that is more proactive, as well as evolving. Just as we think we have it nailed, now comes a new technology or resource that we can add and develop. And I think this is important, embedded in our culture and philosophy, is how can we get better as a team and challenge the effectiveness of our strategy and approach, and what are ways that we can better streamline communication or evaluate that program and look to improve it, and not be still reading the same literature from 20 years ago, or challenge the status quo a little bit. But again, focus and turn it on its head a little bit to look at the athlete experience. And for us, that's simply the holistic interdisciplinary side of it. It doesn't mean that sports psychology, as far as my bias and lens, is the end-all and be-all. For some athletes, that may actually take up a smaller piece of that pie in that time. But it's understanding where our role is and how can we contribute for where that individual is at any period of time. So, a lot of reading and things I would be happy to share with you, and my email at the top for any of you that would like to follow up. But I would love to hear any questions if anyone has any. Thank you. Sure. It's a great question, and I think to a large extent it comes back to the motivational climate of the group and the training environment. So are they trained as, individual athletes who are competing against each other? What we've tried to set up in our two biggest sports are tennis and golf, to some extent, in terms of reputation, certainly. And those are, you ask any of them, and they are individual sport athletes. But if you watch them train, they're really training in a team environment, because the quality of practice, certainly for a tennis player, is relative to the person who's hitting the ball across the net from you. And we are created into teams, partly because it's operating on a college model. But the key motivational difference or motivational climate difference for us is competing with as opposed to competing against. So there is this element of social support. They might not label it in quite the same way, but that's certainly one of the assets that we've been able to leverage is the social and peer influence around them in the sport. But also because we have 8 different sports there, and it's a residential academy. There's the opportunity for or roommates who may be from Qatar or China or England, and also different sports around them too. So they're not just surrounded by athletes who compete in the same sport. So opportunities to look at how you can link some of those areas outside could be really positive as well. Sorry, long-winded answer. But, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.